moderator, I looked into self-concept of athletes. So, in 2019, Putnik et al. Did a study on the developmental stability of scholastic, social, athletic, and physical appearance of self-concept in preschool to early adulthood. And they found that self-concept didn't really change, so it was pretty stable from those time periods, but they really only looked at white European children. So I wonder how their results would vary if their sample size was a little bit more diverse. And so in 2018, Smith and Martini looked at stereotype threat in sport and kind of offered some recommendations to combat stereotype threat in practice and in research. So basically, stereotype threat is when an athlete is reminded of a negative stereotype base that connects with their own identity and their cognitive and physical performance is negatively affected by being reminded of that stereotype. And then so in 2018, Strelo did a study about the self-perception of NCAA Division I student athletes and specifically looked at how self-perception varies based on recent experiences of discrimination of student athletes of all racial identities as well as gender. And one of the findings from that study was that student athletes of minority status, their self-perception was more negatively affected than white student athletes. So for this study, I wanted to look at whether or not race affects the overall self-concept of athletes, and I want to specifically center the experiences and voices of Black athletes. So my main question was, is there a difference in athletes' perception of themselves based on racial identity? And I looked at this through a mixed method approach. So I created an online survey that lasted about 20 minutes, and participants who filled out the survey were entered into a raffle to win a $25 Amazon gift card. And then I also did a virtual interview that lasted about 30 minutes for each interviewee, and all of them were rewarded with $10 Amazon gift card for their participation as well. So for my survey, I had 41 participants, 15 identified as Black, 23 as white, 1 Latina, and 2 mixed race, and both of them identified as Black and white. And then I had 9 men, 25 women, and 7 who did not specify. And then the average age of my participants was 20 years old. So in addition to asking participants questions about their demographics to get a more holistic view of my participants, I also included these 5 measures. So the first one is athletic identity. Second one is self-concept. The third is social comparison. And I want to emphasize the fact that low scores with this specific scale indicated feelings of inferiority. And then trait sport confidence inventory, low scores indicated low confidence in relation to the most confident athlete that they knew. And then my last measure was sport mental toughness. So a little bit of my results. Among all athletes, there's a moderate positive correlation between social comparison and self-concept. So as social comparison levels increased, so as they saw themselves as more superior in relation to other people, their self-concept was also increased. And this was only the case with teams that were predominantly white, and this correlation wasn't significant at all for athletes of both Black and white athletes on predominantly Black teams, which I thought was very interesting. And then between Black and white athletes, Black athletes showed a lower mental toughness score than white athletes. And among Black athletes only, there was a large negative correlation between athletic identity and self-concept. So as they identified less as an athlete, their self-concept increased, and vice versa. And there was a moderate negative correlation between trait sport competence and social comparison. So as they saw themselves as less confident than the most confident athlete they knew, then their social comparison also was increased. So they saw themselves as more superior than others. And then there was also a positive correlation between social comparison and self-concept. So as they saw themselves as more inferior to others, their self-concept also decreased. And then among just white athletes, there was a positive correlation between social comparison and self-concept. So a similar result as Black athletes as my third point. And then I wanted to specifically look at how results varied based on the racial makeup of each athlete's team. And so for athletes on predominantly Black teams, there was no significant difference between questionnaire scores in Black and white athletes, and there were no correlations between any of the questionnaire scores among Black and white athletes. But on predominantly white teams, there were a lot of correlations and differences. So Black athletes showed lower social comparison than white athletes, and lower self-concept levels than white athletes, and lower mental toughness scores than white athletes. And then for Black athletes on predominantly white teams, there was a large negative correlation between athletic identity and self-concept. So similar to what was on the previous slide, as their athletic identity lowered. So as they identified less as an athlete, then their self-concept increased, and vice versa. And then there was a large positive correlation between social comparison and self-concept. So as they saw themselves as more inferior in comparison to others, their self-concept also decreased. And then for white athletes on predominantly white teams, they had a positive correlation between athletic identity and self-concept. So sort of the opposite result as Black athletes on white teams, as white athletes identified more as an athlete, then their self-concept increased. And there was a positive correlation between athletic identity and social comparison. So as they identified more as an athlete, they saw themselves as less inferior. And then there was a positive correlation between social comparison and self-concept. So as they saw themselves as more inferior, their self-concept decreased, and vice versa. So what I thought was, what really stuck out to me about these results was the difference in athletic identity and self-concept correlations between Black athletes and white athletes on predominantly white teams, specifically. So as athletes' self-identified race was incongruent with their team's predominant race, there was a negative correlation between athletic identity and self-concept. And when that team race and self-race was congruent, there was a positive correlation. So I thought that was interesting. So for my interviews, I had 7 interviewees. 3 of them identified as Black, 2 as white, 1 as Latina, and 1 as mixed race Black and Latina. And 3 were men, 3 were female, and 1 did not specify. And then the average age of my interviewees was 22. So I asked a series of questions, and like my survey, I also had demographic questions in addition to questions about experiences as an athlete. So some of the questions that I asked were, in what ways, if any, have sports impacted the way you view the world? What kind of conversations, if any, has your team had about race or racism? During your time as an athlete in your sport, have you ever experienced or witnessed discrimination based on race? And do you believe race has an influence on athletes' overall perspective of themselves in sports? So I created this model based on my interviewees and what they told me and the conversations I had with them. So I recognize that this is very busy and there's a lot of correlations or influences between topics. So in the interest of time, I'm only going to go over a few of them. But I wanted to emphasize the fact that the red arrows indicate the presence of negative racial stereotype influences. The green represent positive racial stereotypes, and the blue represents positive and or negative racial stereotypes. So, and then the black ones indicate influences, but not necessarily mentioned stereotypes. So just because none of my interviewees mentioned the stereotypes doesn't mean that those aren't possible. So I'm gonna go over these connections a little bit. Like I said before, the incongruent and congruent self-race to team race was really interesting to me because I felt like that kind of influenced a lot of other topics and overall self-concept. So as your self-race was incongruent with your team race, it affected the way that you viewed your team's response to racism in 2020. And by that, I mean the, I guess, increase in, I don't want to use the word popularity, but the increase in the presence of conversations of race in America, specifically with Black people. And so the way that you viewed, the way that each interviewee viewed their team's response to that, to last summer, I'll put it that way, was different based on their own identity. And so that also influenced the way that others had expectations of them as a student athlete, which I thought was really interesting. So that's the this box down here. And then perceived race and self-race also influenced expectations of athletes in relation to racism in 2020 as well, which I thought was really interesting. And then as your self-race and team race was congruent, that also influenced the way that they saw racism in 2020 and their team's response. And then the way that their team responded to racism in 2020 also influenced the way that they saw themselves. And then one other thing that I thought was really interesting was the heavy influence of coaches and the relationships that coaches sort of build with their athletes. And so that also had an influence on the expectations of student athletes during the time of last summer and then.
I hit mute. I hear nothing.
Or emphasize is the importance of representation, inclusion, and support and awareness of the differences in experiences of athletes based on racial identity, and the impact that self-identified race and team race congruency has on the experience of athletes and the way that they view themselves and their sport. And then, yeah, so one thing that I thought was really interesting was that while there's an emphasis on community between athletes, the community seemed to be different based on racial identity. So a few future questions that I have is, where do the positive stereotypes and assumptions of athletes stem from, and who has full access to those benefits and who doesn't? And how would these results vary among professional athletes is something that I would be interested in looking at. And a few limitations that affected my results is the small number of participants that I had for the survey and the interviewees, and then although I wanted to focus on the voice of Black athletes, I still had a smaller number of Black survey participants than white survey participants. And then my data collection period was also very short. So,
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauryn. And do a little hands clappy emoji there. Woohoo! All right. Thank you, Lauryn. Next.
I, of course, have questions, but since I've gotten to do a heck of a lot of the speaking, I will try to be quiet and let it open it up to you all. So we, had Lauryn talking about self-concept differences in Black and white athletes. We had Sarah. All right, Amy Edelman, go ahead.
Hi, those were all wonderful presentations. I'm thankful to have the opportunity to participate. Lauryn, I had a question for you about your project. I was curious whether the athletes were from many different sports or just a few, and whether I know you weren't checking for this, but was there a difference in results depending on what sport it was?
Yeah, so my survey participants varied a lot with sports. So yeah, there was a variety of sports with that. And a lot of the pictures on the first slide that I had represented a lot of those sports. But my interviewees, actually, a lot of them were swimmers. So that was kind of skewed a little bit, but yeah, my participants for surveys were a little bit more diverse in sports. And then, yeah, I didn't really look at whether or not the results varied based on sport, but that would also be really interesting to look at. But one thing that I was talking about with the congruency and incongruency with team race and self race was interesting with like looking at Black athletes in stereotypically Black sports was something that I was looking at in relation to that. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but.
Yes, thank you.
Lauryn, I have a question for you in terms of, I think what you were saying, if I followed you correctly, was that there was an increase in self-concept for participants who thought of themselves as less of an athlete. Can you explain that, that quote, perceiving themselves as less of an athlete?
Can you join breakout room 3 or 6?
Well, you mean to throw us all out?
Yeah, I just got booted.
Yeah, we all just got tossed out.
Oh,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened.
Send me back.
Can we go back in?
The room got closed.
Oh, great.
We're back.
Sorry about that. Apparently everybody got booted out of all rooms. It was nothing personal. It was not you. It was all of us. So
The question was like mind-blowing. That's what it was.
yes, it was. It blew up all the breakout rooms. So an excellent question, Lauryn. You are now on the hot spot.
Okay. Sorry, that distracted me, but I think what you were talking about was the correlation between where if white athletes identify more as an athlete than their okay, yeah. So basically athletic identity was looking at whether or not you identify as an athlete. So if you identify more as an athlete as a white person, then you have a higher self-concept versus if you are a Black athlete and you identify more as an athlete, then your self-concept would be, your overall self-concept would be lower. So based on how much you say I am a student athlete or I am an athlete would determine your overall self-concept, if that makes sense.
Got it. I think this was going to have to be our last question. So Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question for Lauryn. I am curious as to you found in your interviews whether or not discussions of race in the current climate since the summer of 2020 have been on an official end, as in like team organized, coach involvement, sort of on that end, or if conversations arose more just organically between teammates. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So that was actually one of my specific interview questions. And like I said before, three of my interviewees were actually swimmers on the same team. So that definitely had an impact on the responses that I got. But that those three swimmers being on predominantly white team was interesting to get their perspective versus two of my interviewees who were Black athletes on predominantly Black teams. It was interesting that they didn't really have official conversations or conversations in general. It was more like a support type environment after last summer versus the implementation of conversations about race and racism on the more predominantly white teams. So I think that answered it well.
Thank you everyone for coming during this weird time. You did wonderful. It was great to have a great big audience. Well done, presenters. Thank you, audience, everyone. We're gonna get zipped out of this breakout room fast, we know. So thank you again. Goodbye.